So we're going to cut the pattern with a muslin fabric. A muslin fabric is used to test your pattern samples. I'll advise you not to use your expensive fabric or a fabric you intend to use to sew a skirt you'll be using. If you're making a pattern for the first time, it's important to test it to check for fitting adjustments you may need, and after you're done with that, you can use whichever fabric you intend to use later on. So folding your fabric, it's very important because you can use different grain lines to achieve different design results. But this we would get to know about later on in other courses. So for now, what we're going to do is we're going to place the pattern over the cloth to cut. So this is the center front. It's on fold. We're going to place it on the folded edge. The back pattern doesn't have to be cut on the fold. I've labeled this cut 2 because we're going to have 2 separate pieces of it and 1 piece of this, but it's going to be on the fold. So I set the back aside. I'm going to fold. If this was long enough, the fabrics comes in different lengths. Some come in 35 inches, 45 inches, 55 inches, 60 inches, and even 70 inches length. This does not have as much length. If it had enough length, when folded, we could place the 2 patterns and cut out at once. So we're going to start with the front pattern. We need to cut this on fold. It's very important when your pattern is labeled cut on fold, you must place the center on a folded edge. So I'm going to pull back this fabric to avoid us having waste. So I'm going to have enough fold to take the skirt. So this is fine. While doing this, I'm going to try to avoid the selvage. This is a bit thick. Most of the time selvages come with like half an inch width, so this is really much. So trying to avoid the selvage. So I need you to see this. The edge of the paper, or rather our pattern, is placed on the folded edge. So we're going to cut this shape out, set it aside, and then we'll cut the back. I'm using a different scissors. You don't ever use the scissors you use for paper to cut fabric. You should have a different scissors for fabric and a different scissors for paper. So we have paper scissors and fabric scissors. If you're going to use the same scissors for paper for cloth, it's not going to work because the scissors you use for paper is going to get blunt easily. So it's good you separate your scissors so it can last much longer. I always like to notch the hip line so that when I'm piecing it together, I can join each point accordingly. And the dart legs, I'm going to create a notch. Just pinch out the dart leg like that and nip it a bit. Pinch this out and nip it. So that's enough for the notches. I can fold this and set it aside. Now we'll fold the other end. I want to mark, your muslin hardly have front or back sides. I'm going to mark the wrong side of each part. So this is important, especially when you're joining two separate pieces. You don't want to turn two different sides facing out or two different sides facing the inside. So I've marked this to be the wrong side of the fabric. So we have right side, wrong side. Wrong side is the inside of the fabric, and the right side is the part that shows to the front. It's the part where people see. Okay, so I've marked the wrong side. So now I'm going to hold this together because I want to mark out a notch where I'm going to have the zip allowance. I should have done this when I had the pattern, but I can still do that. It's 1 inch. I've marked it from here, and then I'm going to mark 3 inches, the allowance we have for the slit at the bottom. I'm also going to notch this. When you have your pieces separate, you may not easily identify them anymore. So the notches help to identify which point to start from or where to stop. Okay. So remember we have our darts here. Always like to start from the back of the skirt because it is two separate parts, and the earlier you piece them together, the better. Because we're going to sew on the wrong side. I'm going to pin at intervals. So now we're going to go to the machine and sew our 1 inch allowance here, and then do the closing for the slit. Now another important thing to note is that you're going to install a zip at the center back. So we'll measure down 7 inches. Remember the hip is 8.5. So we're going to measure down 7 inches from the top. Remember we have half inch allowance, so I'm going to make it 7.5, just to drop down by 1/2 inch rather. Okay, so we're going to sew all the way. Let me mark this so that you can see. There's a 1 inch allowance. So the tailor's chalk is used to mark on fabric. So because this is a test muslin or calico, I can afford to do all the markings I want. But if you're working on an actual fabric that you'll be using, you might not want to have too much markings on it unless you're using a disappearing marker or an invisible chalk. There's a chalk that is not very visible, but you, the sewer, can see. So we're going to sew all the way down, but from the top, the waistline, to the zip allowance, we're going to baste. Basting is a temporal stitch used to hold a fabric, temporarily, depending when you're going to use for some other thing, or maybe you probably want to hold it down in place while you're sewing other parts of the garment. So the basting stitch would not need a back stitch. We just sew with the longest length of on the machine from the waistline to the point where the zip is going to stop, and then from this point we're going to back stitch and sew all the way down. So we are sewing all the way down here to 1/2 inch below point here where the slit opening starts. So I'm going to cut it across like that. So we're going to sew all the way down, pivot, and sew up this part. But before we do that, we're going to overlock the edges so that we don't have rough edges on this part. So So we're going to overlock all the way down and across before we sew. Or if you want, you can still do your stitches and then do your overlocking, whichever is more suitable for you. But we're going to have the edges here overlocked so that we don't have rough edges left hanging, and then we'll sew up this part and press. Then we'll install the zip. I'm going to show you how to install a lapped zipper on the skirt. When we're done with the zip and the slit, then we'll join the two parts of the skirt together. So like I said before, I don't like to take off my pattern until I'm ready to start stitching. You can see all the markings on the pattern. By the time I take it out, you see you just have a blank piece. Okay, so we'll keep this way until you're done with installing the zipper, closing up the opening for the slit, and sewing up the darts. So now we're going to the machine.